This playlist is going to collect together and organize the modules of the second lecture on concepts. In this lecture, we're going to turn our attention to a different theory, the theory-based approach, and compare it with the similarity-based approach, and talk about the relative strengths, weaknesses, and posits. We'll end this lecture by turning to a contemporary approach called the multiple systems view, and specifically we'll talk about the version of the multiple systems view called COVIS that has been advocated by, for instance, Gregory Ashby up at UC Santa Barbara. And we'll talk about how COVIS supposes concepts are learned and how we use them to categorize. Let's start, though, by talking about the theory-based versus similarity-based notions of concepts that emerged in the middle or so 90s. We'll look at general problems for similarity-based views. We'll talk about the difference between conceptual representation for similarity-based views versus theory-based views, how concepts define categories for each group, the units of analysis for each group, the weighting of attributes for each group, the process of categorization according to each theory kind. Then we'll look at theories of interconceptual structure on these two different views, then conceptual development, and finally outline the differences between the two views. And it's important to realize that the classical view, the similarity views, and the theory-based view, all of these views are views that say there's just one process of concept learning, one process of categorization, one way of representing or storing concepts. And as we'll see when we turn to COVIS, that view gets challenged around 2005. You start to see the emergence of these theories, though the theorists were working earlier. So recall when we thought about the prototype theory, a similarity theory, there was this way of explaining typicality of concepts, that typicality structure that we associate with categorization and concept membership, such that we extracted this representation of a central tendency that had a set of features and their most common values, and the things that had the most features in common with that prototype were the most prototypical and most clearly a part of that concept. As we moved away from objects that had those lists of features, we found that the fewer features you had, the more likely it was that you were less typical. And ultimately, we get to these areas where it starts to become much less clear whether or not people have any strong tendency to categorize something as a bird or as not a bird. And so we use the relationship between robins and penguins to illustrate that point. When we looked at the exemplar theory, we saw a similar sort of structure, except the exemplar theory posits multiple exemplars, that is, multiple ways of listing out features for the purposes of categorization. And one of the advantages that the exemplar view seemed to have over the prototype view is that it seemed to be able to handle categorization much more easily for concepts that had highly variable instances, like our dogs here, that vary dramatically in size, in their fur, in their coloring, and so on. Now, there are four major explanatory problems for probability similarity theories, according to Mendon. First, they offer no explanation of why we form the concepts that we do. Similarity in the form of lists of property or attributes is insufficient, since any group of objects will share large numbers of properties and hence be as similar as they are dissimilar. Second, we seem to know much more about conceptualized objects than is dreamed of in the prototype and exemplar theories. So there seems to be more conceptual structure than prototype theory has mechanisms to explain. Third, similarity-based categorization often proves inadequate since different categories can significantly overlap in both features and correlations between those features. So for instance, both birds and insects have wings and can fly, and some insects, in fact, eat other insects, just like birds. Likewise, some birds and some insects eat insects. So there's a significant overlap there. In fact, insects have more in common with birds than penguins have in common with birds, or at least some insects do. And finally, fourth, typicality judgments, as well as their post-categorization effects, exhibit substantial variability between contexts and between individuals. For instance, fruits that are currently in season can become more typical during that period. And likewise, as Eleanor Roche notes, people show perfectly good category effects complete with graded typicality structure for ad hoc goal-derived categories such as good places to hide from the mafia. And this is actually from a paper by Roche. As a result of the perceived problems, changes in the way researchers looked at concepts started to emerge. And the main emphasis of these changes was to hypothesize additional structure within concepts. For instance, sometimes researchers will talk about a prototype core distinction, or they did, where the prototype is a quick and dirty recognition system and the core contains more sophisticated knowledge. And it's from this recognition of the difficulties that similarity views seem to have that we have this emergence of an alternative view, the theory-based view. And the theory-based view is going to not only suppose that there are more features or relationships between those features, but it's going to start looking more like a rule-based view. It's going to look a little bit more like the classical view than similarity views that preceded it, as we'll see. And we'll pick that up in the next module.